Vault Equestria Pure Hearts. Chapter Introduction. I never knew what mutually assured destruction could be until you all shared its balefire with me. There are lessons that ponykind should learn, but can't. Lessons that will never be learned, even after pony civilization tore itself apart. During the last day of the Great War, mega spells from both sides covered much of the world in fiery and horrific destruction. The once magical land of Equestria became silent and dark in a matter of hours. The story didn't end there, though. A great number of ponies were able to seek refuge in Stable-Tec stables. When they opened, the ponies inside spread across the ruins of the old world to rebuild and start a new life. But something else had survived the cleansing balefire. While ponies were susceptible to the taint spread by magic superweapons, guns and ammunition, as well as the undying sins of ponykind, it didn't take long for those who had cheated death to bring those weapons to bear on each other once more. The Equestrian wasteland became an even deadlier and more brutal place. Only the strongest and bravest were able to survive in this post-apocalyptic hell. In spite of destruction, isolated pockets of land were spared from the flames. Most of these places were no paradise, though. They were unpopulated areas so harsh on their own that no pony was stupid or audacious enough to seek a life there. After the Holocaust, these locations only got worse. Frozen North is the largest of these spots, and also the harshest. North of the old city of Van Hoover, and spanning the entire northern border of the wasteland, it was a land of ice and snow-covered mountains. It was also a land of mystery. Rumors spread, and those rumors became legends. One of those legends told of a great power that was lost before the fateful day during the war, hidden in a veil of white. No pony went in search of these legends and ever returned. Those that managed to survive the torrent of snow and freezing winds ended up hopelessly lost in the whiteout. A new legend has begun, though. A legend that will follow a young mare and her best friend on their journey through this frozen waste as they seek out that power. But all legends have a beginning, some greater than others. This one, however, starts among the dull grey metal walls in the depths of Stable 61. Vault Equestria Pure Hearts. Chapter 1. First Steps. My dearest teacher, my continuing studies of pony magic have led me to discover that we are on the precipice of disaster. Another boring day at work. Life as a stable security officer tends to be uneventful, especially in a stable as small as the one I call home. While I didn't dislike my job, I sometimes longed for something more. I often dreamt of having big adventures in places I had heard of and learned about in school. I was only ever able to imagine these places as they'd been in the past, though, seeing as I spent my years growing up in the stable and never knew what actually had become of the outside world. Stable 61, the smallest of all the Stable-Tec stables, held only 210 ponies at its maximum. Now there are only 152 of us left, after a large amount of the older population had succumbed to disease. An unknown plague had ran rampant amongst the residents in the last few years, before it simply disappeared. Living in such a small community caused us to grow very close to each other. Every pony knew every pony else, though it also meant that there were very few ponies to fill positions required to keep the stable in working order. Every pony had their role, and every role had its pony. We managed to keep everything running for generations, despite a few hiccups along the way, but this small workforce meant that I was actually the only security officer in the stable. It was probably a good thing that work was so uneventful. There would be no way I could keep up with things if they got too hectic. I stepped into my quarters and laid my security pistol and other tools on my desk, the vents starting to blow hot air, warming the room to a comfortable temperature. I felt the breeze against my light grey coat as it wafted gently through my golden mane and lightly armoured security barding. I closed my eyes and imagined a white dove carrying a red heart in its grip as it flew aloft in that breeze. The very same image that was my cutie mark. The story behind the mark, well, I try not to think about it. As peaceful as the image seems, the history isn't quite as nice. Dovetail! I snapped back to my reality and see a mint green unicorn mare with a long, flowing white mane standing in the doorway of my room. She pushed the pair of reading glasses that sat in front of her bright blue eyes back into place. They always had a tendency to slip down her muzzle. Oh, hey there, Lily Bloom. Don't hey Lily Bloom me, like nothing's wrong. Don't tell me you forgot. I was a little confused at this. I didn't think I'd missed anything, but I had the feeling that Lily was going to fill me in on what it was regardless. Today is the day the Overmare selects 2 ponies for a scouting mission out of the stable. I brought my pick back up, checking the date, and slapped my forehead with my hoof. Of course, how could I have forgotten? You can be quite forgetful sometimes, Dove, Lily said teasingly. I shot her a cross look, but lightened up as we both started giggling a little. It was true, I was a bit forgetful. Well, I guess we hurry along then, I suggested. With a nod, Lily turned back out of my door, and I caught a glimpse of her cutie mark. A Stable-Tec terminal with a holotape next to it. I always envied her for her skills with Stable-Tec equipment of all sorts. She once hacked into my pip-buck from a remote terminal just to display a big old "Hi" on the screen, just for the fun of it. As smart as she was, though, she was also a little mischievous. Sometimes too much for her own good. The walk through the stable wasn't a long one, given the shelter's size, though it felt long. The dull grey metal walls all blending together into a labyrinth of turns and straights, halls and stairs. The dim lights that illuminated them seemed to be ever burning and gave the whole place a very sombre, boring mood. Every once in a while, one of them would flicker for a few seconds, and I would take notice, but it would pass without a second thought. The entire stable, while it was my home, felt confining. Anything more than the daily routine was rare, even if it was short-lived. The most exciting thing I could remember was the one I didn't want to remember. As we walked, I began to imagine the walls of the stable fading away, replaced by a daydreamer's fantasy world. Bang! The next thing I knew, I had a throbbing ache in my head as my vision swam violently. Lily, who had now put her hoof on my shoulder to steady me, struggled to ask if I was okay through the fits of laughter that had befallen her. Coming to my senses, I had realized that I'd walked headfirst into one of the stable's many locker doors that lined the atrium. Some pony had left one open, and being lost in my own little world again, I followed Lily into the atrium and neglected to see it. I also took notice that it wasn't just Lily Bloom who was laughing at me. The entire stable population was there, laughing their flanks off at my embarrassment. The booming voice of an older mare filled the room, and the stable fell silent. The overmare stepped out of her office, horn glowing with a voice-amplifying spell, ready to address her subjects. The platform on which she stood now overhung the atrium, and from there everybody could see her clearly. I blushed a little, rubbing my aching head, and turned my attention to the same point that everybody else was focused on. My fellow stable-dwellers, I trust you all know why you've been gathered here. In case you've forgotten, though, let me remind you. Stable 61 has been in operation for 200 years now, And while we reached the predetermined point at which Stable-Tec required us to open the stable doors years ago, the previous overmayors found it best to keep them shut. However, I feel that with our bicentennial anniversary of the stable's closing, it is time for us to step out into the world above. Our first order of business is to send out a scouting party to make contact with whoever or whatever is out there and analyze any immediate threats. An applause of celebration broke out, and the Overmare called once again for calm. Now, Stable-Tec calls for scouting parties to consist of 3 or more ponies, but there are so few of us that I would feel better only sending parties of 2. So, any volunteers? Despite the earlier enthusiasm at the mention of getting out of this happy imprisonment and into the outside world, not a soul stirred at this prompt, not even Lily. I knew she dreamt of getting out of this place as much as I did. I guess she was just stifled by the crowd's overall initiative, or lack thereof. As for why I didn't volunteer myself, I guess I was just a dreamer instead of an adventurer. I wanted to lead the stable, but I couldn't work up the courage to do so of my own accord. I thought as much, the Overmare continued. She sounded a little dismayed at the surveyed crowd for any change. I took the initiative and fed the names of every pony in the stable through our mainframe to determine those best suited for the job. The first choice should have been obvious. Given the unknown nature of the outside world, we need some pony with some sort of safety and firearms proficiency. As much as I didn't want to hear the name she was about to call, I knew exactly who she was talking about. After all, I was the only security officer and the only one with firearms training. I felt my stomach lurch, but not sure if it was out of excitement or fear. Dovetail, as our security officer, you should be well qualified for this role. I knew now it was definitely fear. I wanted nothing more but to disappear as the crowd directed its attention towards me once more. My heart told me that this was my chance to leave these walls, but my mind kept telling me no. There was no denying the Overmare, though. Yes, ma'am, I will do my best, I managed to mutter out sheepishly. I looked at Lily nervously. Her face had grown solemn. I imagined she was afraid that I would be leaving her behind. I would open my mouth to tell her it would be okay, but I was cut off as the Overmare called out the next name. Lily Bloom, you will accompany Dovetail as your partner. Your technical skills should come in handy for any technology you come across that's still working out there. My friend's exasperation turned to one of near depression, to sheer excitement. Her eyes lit up brighter than the brightest light in the stable at this, though that wasn't saying much, and she promptly informed me why. Well, I wasn't really wanting to go myself, which was why I didn't volunteer. But now that we'll be braving the new world together, isn't this exciting, Dove? Yeah, I guess, I replied, still not sure, or more likely, when, I was going to vomit from the nerves that had gripped my stomach and turned it into some sort of pre-war pretzels I had read about somewhere. I wish I had the same fortitude as my friend. That settles it then, the Overmare proceeded. You'll leave first thing tomorrow morning. So what do you think we'll find out there? Lily raised a good question as she slipped her equipment into her saddlebags. I shrugged. Even with all the reading I had done about the old world above, there really wasn't any telling what lay beyond the stable door. For all we knew, it could have been a fertile green world, or it could have been a hellish empty waste. My bets were on the latter, though, but then again, there may not have been actually an outside world at all anymore. Well, whatever we encounter out there, I'm glad we're going together, Lily said, breaking me from my thoughts on what we'd discover and shifting them elsewhere. She had, for the longest time, liked me as more than a friend, and she wasn't shy about it. She tried a few relationships with the fine colts our age, but nothing ever stuck. She always told me that it was she couldn't keep her mind on them, and it kept drifting back to me. I never could bring myself to accept the idea. I simply couldn't see her as more than my best friend, even when I tried. I had my mind set on cults, but my luck with them had always kept me single. And then I jumped. The door to the room we were preparing in had opened abruptly, scaring me back into the familiar dull grey of the stable. The overmare stepped in and looked us over with scrutinizing eyes, as she was humming a little affirmations to herself. "Well," she began, "seems both of you are fairly ready." I looked down. I hadn't even realized that I had mindlessly completed packing my saddlebags, filled my water canteen, slung my 10mm pistol over my other bags, and I was all ready to go. Equipment-wise, at least. I turned to see that Lily had done the same. "What do you mean, fairly ready?" I inquired. "I only say fairly, since there's no telling what's out there." My mind flashed back to thoughts of earlier. "There is no preparing you completely for the unknown. The most I can offer you is some advice. Expect the unexpected, and whatever happens, trust in each other. You are each other's greatest strengths." We both nodded to the overmare, and then to each other. I couldn't see how we could ever be torn apart. "All right then, if you two are ready, let's proceed." Following the overmare out of the room into a much larger chamber behind it, I took a deep breath to calm my nerves. This was going to be my first time, or rather, the first time any of Stable 61's residents outside our dreary but strangely homely walls, and I was far more nervous than I could ever remember being before. Then my heart just about stopped, as the rush of fear, adrenaline, or whatever it was flooded over me. The overmare pulled the lever on the nearby console, and the whole place shook as the mechanisms hidden somewhere began to work. The room was filled with control panels, and on the side opposite the door, we entered through a huge gear-shaped chunk of metal wedged solidly into its purpose-built slot in the wall. Above hung a giant control arm that now swung down to make contact with the steel gear. My imagination began to picture a big black empty void on the other side of that door. That it would open and there would be nothing there, and that we would all be sucked into its endless space. An ear-shattering screech resounded through the room, amplified by the metal walls, and the door to Stable 61 was pried out from its centuries-old resting place and rolled to the side. Revealed on the other side was not the desolate nothingness I had pictured, but instead there was a long, dark tunnel of natural rock. Far up the tunnel I could barely make out traces of light that seeped through cracks in what seemed to be an old door. When the sound of grinding metal finally ceased, the entrance to the stable finally stood agape before us, and the overmare addressed us once again. "It is time for us to part ways now. Report back to us 1 week time with your findings. Also, here's a little gift from me to help you with your mission." She then pulled out 2 shiny new pip bucks from her saddlebag. They were obviously much nicer than the version on our old 2000 models. "These are the latest pip buck models, the 4000 series. Logs say they were only issued to for experimental purposes by Stable-Tec, but we never actually needed them," she elaborated as we swapped out our old ones for the new ones and powered them up, and gave her a quick thanks. "Now, go on you two, and good luck." Nodding to each other, Lily and I took our first steps outside our metal home. The dirt under our hooves was softer and more malleable than we had any in our synthetic underground farms, and it seemed so much more, well, natural. And we had turned with a jerk as the mechanism behind us had sprung to life once more, sealing the stable off from us. My heart wrenched. I was leaving my home. It took everything I had to avert my gaze from that gateway back to safety. But eventually I was able to turn my attention back to the tunnel and the door ahead of us. I was finally going to get that big adventure I had dreamed of, even if it did feel a bit forced upon me now. I remembered an old saying I'd read in one of my favorite books. Kites rise highest against the wind, not with it. Come on, Lily. Let's do this. While I still have the will to not turn back again. She pulled her own eyes away from our past and towards the future that lay beyond the tattered and wooden door. Our own adventure waited on the other side. As we approached, it was evident that the door hadn't been disturbed since the stable closed. The hinges were rusted through and looked like they could have given away with the slightest amount of force. The wood was terribly rotten and warped, and despite its visual condition, it still moved smoothly as I turned the lock and cracked it open. A blinding light began to overthrow the darkness the more I pulled, and eventually it overtook my vision. We were free. Footnote: Level up. New perk: Security training. +5 to small guns, and you are 20% more accurate with small guns, but fire 10% slower.